50 years ago, on the 20th of July 1974, Turkish Marines landed on Cyprus, and the first of two phases of fighting began. This conflict brought NATO allies Greece and Turkey to the brink of war. In this video, I'm going to look at the relative strengths of the Greek and Turkish air forces in 1974 to understand how they could influence the crisis. In doing so, I'll briefly recap how those forces evolved in the 2 decades prior, as it offers an insight into the development of Cold War air forces outside of the superpowers. To give a reference point, in 1974, NATO's state-of-the-art was the F-4 Phantom. The F-14 would enter squadron service later in the year. The F-15 was 2 years away, and the F-16 4 years out. In the strike role, the US was still introducing the F-111, having started in 1967. In Central Europe, A-7s, F-104s, and F-100s formed a significant proportion of the alliance's fleet. At sea, they could also deploy the highly effective A-6 Intruder. Aside from the Hawkeye, true AWACS aircraft were 5 years or so away. On the other side of the Iron Curtain, 1,000 or so MiG-23s were in service, so the bulk of the tactical inventory was made up of MiG-21s and versions of the Sukhoi Fighter series. Su-24s were just starting to be introduced. Interceptors were a mix of Flagons and Foxbats, supported by thousands of older types. At this point, the Soviet Navy depended on Badgers, Backfires, and Bears for naval strike. They had no fixed-wing carrier aviation. Cyprus had no air force of its own. President Makarios had attempted to purchase SA-2 guideline missiles from the Soviet Union in the early 1970s to provide air defense, and he had people trained on the system in Egypt. But NATO successfully blocked the transfer of the missiles. Any hope that the Cypriot leadership had of preventing Turkish fighters roaming all over the island in support of their actions therefore rested with their allies in Athens. The Greek junta's options were somewhat limited, as the 1974 Cyprus conflict illustrated a stark imbalance in the air forces of Greece and Turkey. The Turkish Air Force started out with around 292 combat aircraft versus 225 for the Greek. On the surface, the numerical imbalance doesn't seem too bad, but the Turkish fighter fleet was also more modern than the Greek. 234 Turkish fighters, about 80%, were relatively modern supersonic types. Only around 120 Greek aircraft were in the same class, which is about half of their fleet. Both sides were almost exclusively equipped with US-made combat aircraft, acquired via military assistance that the US had begun to provide in the aftermath of World War II to prevent Soviet expansion into the Eastern Mediterranean. It had taken over this role from Britain due to the empire's post-war bankruptcy. From the 1950s onwards, the US also leased important bases from both countries, again to enable power projection in the region and to offer a threat to the Warsaw Pact's southern flank. During a period of relative calm between the two countries, Greece and Turkey had both joined NATO on the same day in 1952, but issues over Cyprus during its messy transition out of British colonial rule soured those cordial relations. After a flirtation with violence in 1964, things actually improved somewhat in the years afterwards. Joint exercises under the NATO banner were frequent, although the relationship between Greece and NATO cooled during the late 1960s and early 1970s before improving in the early years of the 1970s. Then another serious face-off developed, first over oil exploration rights in the Aegean and then over Cyprus. Despite their overall inferior position, the Hellenic Air Force did possess the most powerful warplane available to either side, in the form of half a dozen F-4E Phantom IIs. These were the initial batch of 36 aircraft that had been ordered under the US Peace Icarus program. Having only arrived in April 1974, they were some way from full operational status by July. Some sources claim that as many as 23 Phantoms were available, but even if this was the case, the 30-plus aircrew required to fly them were in the US being trained. This was rather unfortunate for the Greeks, as they were effectively the only aircraft they had with the combination of range and capabilities to challenge the Turks over Cyprus from the available Greek bases. Even the Phantom would have been at the limit of its range. The small base at Castelli was around 450 nautical miles from the landing zones. Suda Bay was a little further out. In cap configuration with 3 drop tanks, the Phantom could just about manage a 15 to 20 minute patrol before having to return. Since they lacked tankers, the extended distance between their bases and Cyprus was a fundamental impediment to the Greek Air Force. Although potent in the Aegean, it was effectively toothless in the eastern Mediterranean. Acquisition of the Phantom was a sign of how the relationship between the US and Greece had begun to recover after the issues of the late 1960s, which had seen NATO withdraw its support for several years. NATO had, of course, been fundamental to the recovery of the Greek military following the Second World War. Greece had been overrun by Nazi Germany in 1941, having successfully defended itself against the initial Italian attack. Some Greek air units were reformed with British support in 1942, flying Hurricanes in the Western Desert Campaign. Later they would fly Spitfires against Axis forces in Greece, where they were joined by squadrons flying Blenheims, Ansons and Baltimores. British aircraft continued to equip the majority of Greek squadrons in the immediate post-war period. Spitfire Mark 9s and Mark 16s formed the backbone of the force that engaged communist guerrillas in the country's north during 1946 and 47. The US also donated 108 T-6 Texans for training use, and the first of an eventual 89 C-47 Dakotas. 6 of these were actually modified to drop 500-pound bombs as makeshift bombers. A detachment of Dakotas actually served with the UN forces in the Korean War as well. Being broke meant that the Greek government simply couldn't afford to buy more or more modern aircraft. They did manage to acquire 42 used Curtiss Helldivers from the US Navy in August 1949, and they used them to great effect in the Civil War. It was only entry into NATO in 1952 and the resultant availability of US funding through MAP and its predecessors that really allowed the Hellenic Air Force to properly expand and modernise. US engineers built a dozen new or upgraded air bases for the Greeks, all connected by fuel pipelines and supported by 9 early warning radar stations. The bases are worth dwelling on for a moment. This map shows the locations most relevant to operations in the eastern Mediterranean. Although most were modern facilities, the closest, at Suda Bay, was 475 nautical miles from Cyprus. Suda Bay was a major US air and sea base at this time, having been leased to the US in partial exchange for security and economic assistance. Other bases on the Greek mainland were also well equipped, but they were too far from the eastern Mediterranean to be useful. Although the US regularly deployed KC-135s to Suda Bay, they were not about to let the Greeks use them or allow them to obtain their own tanker aircraft. For this reason, the Greek Air Force had built a limited base at Castelli near Heraklion. This facility had a fuel dump but only limited ammo storage and aircraft handling facilities. Alongside infrastructure and training investments, the US also supplied 82 surplus Canadair Mark II and IV Sabres and 133 F-84G Thunderjets, alongside T-33 advanced trainers. These aircraft were enough to equip 4 wings of fighters. Before they were all delivered in 1956, the Greek government decided to upgrade the fleet, though, acquiring the F-84F Thunderstreak swept-wing fighter bomber that would form the backbone of their tactical infantry for nearly 2 decades. In 1961, the US transferred 38 F-86D Sabre dogs from Air Defense Command stocks to provide night and all-weather interception capabilities. These were overhauled at Fiat in Italy, where they were upgraded to fire the AIM-9B Sidewinder alongside their air-to-air rockets. Sabre dogs would be the main interceptors available to the Hellenic Air Force until the arrival of surplus F-102s and Canadian-built starfighters. These remained the most potent operational fighters on the Greek side. The first 37 F-104Gs were received in 1964 and equipped 335 and 336 squadrons. In 1972, the US provided 9 more aircraft transferred from the Spanish Air Force, which were mainly used to replace airframes lost in accidents. Greece had received F-104s as tactical nuclear weapons delivery vehicles, but they were obviously free to use them in other strike roles. The Starfighter offered similar range to the Phantom, but was able to carry only about a quarter of the ordnance. As an air superiority fighter, in G form at least, it had half the magazine depth an inferior radar, and no beyond visual range weapons. In 1965, Greece had received 55 F-5A Freedom fighters under MAP, making them the first NATO country to operate the type. The F-5 cost half as much as the F-104 to run, and it soon became clear that the relatively cash-strapped Hellenic Air Force would be better off with F-5s as the backbone of their fleet than starfighters. The coup and excessive demand for Northrop's fighter meant that no more of them would be received ahead of 1974. Used as a lead-in trainer and interceptor with a secondary fighter-bomber role, the F-5 was mainly used over the Aegean. The bulk of the tactical inventory, and the only Greek tactical aircraft with the range to reach Cyprus, was the venerable F-84F Thunderstreak. Greece had received 202 of these in the 1960s, mostly drawn from retired US, Luftwaffe, and Dutch stocks. Serviceability of the type was relatively poor due to their age and the years of limited support for Greece via NATO after the military coup of 1967. Even so, approximately 115 aircraft were in service in 1974. With a combat radius carrying a light load of bombs in the region of 600 nautical miles, the Thunderstreak could operate over Cyprus, and indeed some aircraft from the 115th Wing at Suda Bay were forward deployed to Heraklion in order to extend their reach that bit further. Use of the F-84F in any conflict would have been a gamble, however, as an encounter with a Turkish F-104, F-100 or F-5 would likely have ended badly for the older jet, operating as it was on the edge of its range. 38 Thunder Flash Photo Recon aircraft remained in service as well. These had demonstrated the theory of F-84 operations over Cyprus in 1964, albeit with some close shaves caused by the dangerously tight fuel margins. Finally, there were 19 single-seat and 5 two-seat F-102 Delta Daggers, used as area interceptors against Soviet bombers which would target missile bases in the event of a full-scale war. The Delta Dagger remained a useful all-weather bomber interceptor, although the aircraft were complex and now aging. The Deuce had the range to get from Suda Bay to Cyprus when carrying tanks, but had quite limited ability to take on other fighter-sized aircraft when it got there. For this reason, none of the aircraft made their way south and east during the crisis. As I mentioned earlier, the HAF had no tanker aircraft. They had 2 or 3 modified Albatros amphibians equipped with antennas and displays for electronic intercept, and at least one of those aircraft carried barrage jammers. The remaining 50 or so Dakotas and 50 used Nor Atlases acquired from Germany provided troop and cargo transport. The US assessment at the time was that the HAF had insufficient strength in 1974 to cover all of mainland Greece, Crete, and the Dodecanese Islands. In addition to the small size of the force by 1970 standards, most of the aircraft were obsolete, particularly in the interceptor fleet. GCI capabilities were regarded as insufficient, with the newly upgraded Sector Operations Center only able to control up to 6 intercepts at a time. Only 5 of the 14 GCI sites had electronic counter-countermeasures capabilities, and thus they would be very vulnerable to jamming. The Tactical Air Force was trained and tasked with the support of the Greek army in the field in mind. But again, lack of airframes, and in particular lack of sophistication of those airframes, meant that the HAF would be unlikely to survive long above a 1970s battlefield. ECM was a particular challenge, with only a handful of Greek aircraft even having radar warning gear, let alone the ability to jam or deceive SAM and AAA radars. There were no plans to equip the new F-4s with ECM pods. What the order of battle doesn't show is the condition of the Greek Air Force as an organization and as a fighting force. The Air Force of 1974 was still somewhat demoralized as a lasting result of its involvement in the King's counter-coup against the junta in December 1967. Air Force units at all levels had carried out orders issued by their higher commands without questioning their political origin. Wing and squadron commanders who had been unfortunate enough to be on duty during this confusing period were relieved of their commands for obeying and issuing illegal orders. This resulted in a significant loss of experience in the service and a lack of organizational strength in depth that persisted in 1974. Pro-junta junior officers were often assigned to senior staffs as watchdogs to ensure political reliability, further reducing operational flexibility and the ability to take risks. Even so, the 20,000-strong Greek Air Force remained a well-trained organisation. Their training regime was modelled on the contemporary US system. 62% of the manpower base were conscripts who served for 2 years. More technically skilled men would serve 30 months. Given the relative age of its equipment, the Air Force's greatest strength was probably the quality of its personnel. They were the best educated of the Greek military services, and partly because of the suspicion directed at them, they were arguably the most patriotic and committed. Pilots were drawn from the Air Force Academy, which ran a 4-year course for officers. Training began with 125 hours in the T-41, starting in the second year of the academy. In the third year, pilots then graduated to the T-37 for 96 hours of jet conversion. Then 87 hours in T-33s were received in the fourth year. The US Air Force assessed this program to be excellent. Logistics were also relatively good. Although the Greek industrial base could only produce a small number of weapons and parts, a single logistics hub served all the bases, with stock managed by an IBM mainframe. Depot-level maintenance could be performed on all types of aircraft, but major components like engines and avionics generally needed to be shipped back to the US for overhaul. Although it would have no role to play in the Cyprus standoff, for completeness I should mention Greece's army aviation, correctly known as the HACA or Hellenic Army Command Aviation. HACA had 177 aircraft, broken down into 101 utility planes, 49 old piston engine helicopters, and 27 modern turbine types. These were divided into an aviation battalion attached to the Greek First Army and 14 aviation companies serving smaller formations. All of the aircraft were of US origin, and they had been supplied under map. In the summer of 1974, HACA had 275 pilots. Typically, they were well trained. Army fixed-wing aviators received a 27-week course consisting of 120 hours of flight time. Helicopter pilots were then drawn from this cadre, having completed a further 12-week conversion course. In summary, the Greek Air Force was a well-trained force, able to fight effectively and generate a good sortie rate. But in 1974, it was also a force with substantial weaknesses in aircraft modernity, mission tasking, and strategic planning. Operations over Cyprus were largely beyond its capabilities. The Turkish Air Force, or HVKK, didn't take part in the Second World War. It therefore had equipped itself with equipment purchased from both sides of the conflict. Turkish Spitfires flew alongside Focke-Wulf 190s. They also operated Beaufighters, Blenheims, Beauforts, Liberators, Mosquitoes, and Hurricanes. I'm sure I'll have missed some of the incredible collection they'd amassed. Consolidating this fleet was the first task in the post-war years. In this, they were also helped by the US, who took over from the British as the main financial and military backer of the Turkish military. As with Greece, entry into NATO unlocked a vast infrastructure construction program that built new airfields, fuel depots, communications facilities, and radar stations. A large training base at Eskişehir provided basic training for hundreds of pilots. Jet training was set up at Balıkesir, flying the first of 48 T-33s. The first deliveries from the inevitable F-84G fleet were received in January 1952. 90 came in 1952, then 135 in 53, 83 in 54, and a further 172 between 1955 and 1958. That's 480 Thunderjets in total. Like Greece, Turkey also got surplus Sabres, receiving 107 Canadair examples between 1954 and 56, as well as 46 Thunder Flashes to form a reconnaissance squadron. Having been a major user of the Thunderjet, Turkey was offered Thunder Streaks as a natural upgrade path. Between 1959 and 1966, the HVKK received 300 Thunder Streaks. The first of these aircraft came from the French Air Force, with later ones being provided by Germany and the Netherlands. The latter were upgraded to F-84Q standard. By the time 1974 came around, though, most of them had been retired. Whereas the Hellenic Air Force was left with those aging subsonic F-84s, the HVKK had moved on to supersonic types. The backbone was the F-100 Super Sabre, of which they operated 3 variants, the C, the D, and the F. The first aircraft had arrived in October 1958, with the inventory building to over 200 examples, most of which came from US stocks. 28 were refurbished Danish aircraft. Mainly used as fighter bombers, the F-100s had been heavily engaged in 1964, attacking both land and Cypriot naval targets. Although still rather underappreciated today, the F-100 was a durable, well-armed aircraft. It could lift substantially more weapons than a starfighter and carry them over a comparable distance. Flown sensibly and smoothly, it was a trustworthy mount, although it was always able to catch out those not used to its challenging low speed and high angle of attack handling characteristics. Turkish pilots nicknamed it Baba for its slightly stately appearance, strong construction, and reliable flight qualities. As with the HAF, the Turkish Air Force also received 34 F-104Gs and 2 RF-104Gs under MAP in May 1963, giving them an ability to drop US-controlled nuclear weapons as well as perform Mach 2 interception and air defense missions. Since the F-104 was also the Greeks' primary air superiority option, the two sides were evenly matched. F-4s were also incoming, but not operational in the summer of 1974. Although the Turkish Air Force had clear numerical superiority over the Greek, the contemporary US assessment was that the overall effectiveness of the force was reduced by inability to maintain high aircraft availability rates. Turkey's industrial base was somewhat better than Greece's at the time, but it still wasn't capable of deep maintenance of advanced avionics or engines. The issue was compounded by a training program for officers and men that was rated only average by NATO. That isn't to say that Turkey didn't have a cadre of excellent pilots, more that the training they received before joining squadrons wasn't as good and therefore they took longer to be fully effective. Turkish ground control intercept was no better than the Greek, and although their bases were much closer to Cyprus, they had no radar coverage over the island. Lacking airborne warning, combat air patrols would be the old-fashioned type, relying on the Mark I Model 0 human eyeball for detection. That said, the proximity of the F-100 base at Konya and the F-104 base at Eskişehir meant that Turkish tactical jets would have free reign over Cyprus, and they would use that fact to great effect in supporting the landings and later operations, even if coordination with the Turkish Navy was less than excellent. Although they lacked even basic electronic countermeasures and signals intelligence aircraft, the Turkish Navy's S-2 trackers gave them faster and higher quality maritime surveillance capabilities than that provided by the Greek albatrosses. Turkey also had no access to tankers, but they didn't need them operationally. What they did have were excellent troop lift capabilities, based around 8 C-130s, 20 C-160s, and as many as 100 C-47s. The CIA assessed that they could drop up to 4,000 paratroops in a single operation, and they had sufficient helicopters for an airborne assault of 1,000 men. These capabilities were about to be put to the test. Greece and Turkey were not the only players in and around Cyprus in July 1974. Although Cyprus was an independent country, Great Britain retained a sizable base on the island. During the 1964 crisis, RAF Lightnings had intercepted Greek aircraft over Cyprus, preventing them from taking photos of Turkish activity below by rocking them with jet wash. British options for intervention had become more limited in the decade that followed, though. Although Akrotiri and its 9,000-foot runway remained operational, there was no permanent combat aircraft presence in the summer of 1974. Instead, it played host to aircraft transiting to and from Asia, and occasionally short deployments by V-bombers, which practiced strikes on the Soviet underbelly. Lightning and Nimrod squadrons would also rotate through the base on a periodic basis, but it isn't clear whether any aircraft were operating there in 1974. The base's very large search radar was, however, fully operational, enabling NATO to keep tabs on what was going on over the island. A Bloodhound SAM battery protected the base from air attack, and HMS Hermes and her battle group were in the area. The carrier was accompanied by the destroyer Devonshire and the frigates Brighton and Rill. The US Navy also had a carrier battle group in the Mediterranean, and it was rather more potent than Hermes, which by this point operated only 20 Sea Kings and no fixed-wing aircraft. USS Forrestal would deploy rapidly west of Cyprus, accompanied by the destroyer William H. Stanley, and then the Jesse L. Brown and the Patterson. The assault ship Incheon and the guided missile-armed command cruiser Little Rock were also in the area, amongst other assets. Forrestal's air group was the primary force projection option, though, and it consisted of VF-11 Red Rippers and VF-74 Bedevilers, both flying the F-4J Phantom. Attack Squadrons VA-81 Sunliners and VA-83 Rampagers, flying the A-7E Corsair II. Attack Squadron VA-85, the Black Falcons, operating the A-6E and the KA-6D Intruder. Reconnaissance Attack Squadron 6, the Fleurs, flying the magnificent RA-5C Vigilante, and then the Closeouts and Tridents, which flew the E-2B Hawkeye and the SH-3D Sea King, respectively. Typically, the Supercarriers Air Group was the most powerful single force in the region. If it had been commanded, it would have been able to fully close the airspace over Cyprus and potentially also the sea access. Although the Soviet Union had made some attempts to inflame the situation in Cyprus to its own ends, it notably didn't surge naval forces into the area as the crisis emerged. The Kinder-class cruiser Grozny and some other smaller combatants were in the Mediterranean, but they weren't joined by heavier units. Soviet operations focused on evacuating their nationals from Cyprus. So in summary, the Greek and Turkish air orders of battle in July 1974 demonstrate just how hard it was for the average country to successfully modernize their air arms in the first decades of the Cold War. Even establishing a force of modern tactical aircraft was hard, let alone constructing an integrated air force able to project power more than a few hundred miles from a country's own shores. When the balloon went up on July the 20th, 1974, both forces went into action with great commitment and skill, but very misshapen capabilities.